I think it's time now. Shall we start? SEAFDEC Secretary General, Ms. Malini Smith-Litty, Deputy Secretary General, Mr. Honda, all invited speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. On behalf of SEAFDEC, I would like to welcome all of you to SEAFDEC webinar series on WTO Fisheries Subsidy Draft Consolidated Text Negotiating Group on Rules. And thank you for joining us today. And it is opportune time to organize the 2021 webinar on fisheries subsidy. I believe that this event would provide you useful information of the current status of the WTO fisheries subsidy on the draft consolidated text, which will be 2 more meetings by the WTO this year. And before we start, please allow me to provide you information on our virtual ground rules. If you have questions, please use the Q&A button. And some selected questions will be chosen by our moderator and asked the speaker during the Q&A session. And you can use the chat box only the messages that are relevant to the subject. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded on our SEAFDEC YouTube channel that enable for reviewing by those who cannot join this webinar at this time. The link of YouTube as shown on the screen. And the webinar is now live on SEAFDEC Facebook. You can also visit our SEAFDEC Facebook in case that you have the technical problem on the Zoom webinar. And without further ado, at this time, I would like to invite Ms. Malini Smith-Litty, SEAFDEC Secretary General, to kindly deliver the opening remarks. Madam Malini, please.
Thank you, MC. Distinguished speakers, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to welcome you all to this 2021 SEAFDEC webinar on WTO fishery subsidy. Last year, SEAFDEC organized the webinar on WTO fishery subsidies, and we have learned the progress, challenges, and issues of the WTO fishery subsidy negotiation from representatives of relevant organizations such as WTO, FAO, and IISD. Last month, WTO draft consolidated text has been updated, and it is expected to reach an agreement on fisheries subsidy during ministerial meeting on July this year. It is timely for us to get more information and views on this updated text. Major output and recommendations from today will be further discussed among SEAFDEC member countries for their better understanding on this negotiation. I would like to express my sincere thanks to all speakers and participants, and I hope the meeting will be fruitful and productive. I wish you all good health and success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, SG. And now we go to the panel discussion, and our moderator, Dr. Walavit Wanchana, he is the Policy and Program Coordinator of SEAFDEC Secretariat. He will moderate the session today. May I invite Dr. Walavit, please?
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm Walavit of the SEAFDEC Secretariat. I'm a moderator of today's session of our SEAFDEC webinar series on the WTO fishery subsidy. Today we have a number of speakers in this afternoon from Bangkok, Thailand. I will provide you a short brief on what we are going to do today. May I start with the introducing you what kind of the program that we are doing now. This program is under the we call ASEAN SEAFDEC Strategic Partnership ASSP Fisheries Consultative Group Mechanism. This program is under ASEAN and SEAFDEC Collaborative Program. We have a project supporting this program titled assistance for capacity building development in the region to support ASEAN member states on international fisheries related issues. As everyone aware, we have the international targets on the sustainable development goals, number 14, life below water. In that SDG number 14.6, it was stated that the SDG 14.6 by 2020 to prohibit a certain forms of fishery subsidy which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing, and refrain from introducing new of such subsidy, recognizing an appropriate and effective special and differential treatments for developing and least developing countries, which should be an integral part of the WTO fishery subsidies negotiation. And with the proposed indicator, including percentage of fish tonnage landed within maximum sustainable yield, or MSY. Under our ASEAN SEAFDEC program, we have adopted at Council and ASEAN mechanism high level on the resolution plan of action on sustainable fisheries for food security for ASEAN region towards 2030. In this regional plan of action resolution, we have the session on fish trade, where SEAFDEC mandate and our ASEAN member state is to collaborate on the issues to strengthen collaboration and mechanisms among ASEAN member states to work towards common positions that could be reflected in the international fish trade related fora, for example, the WTO, FAO Coffee on fish trade, OIE, CAC, and other international fora as CITES. The picture I'm showing you here is our recent meeting, SEAFDEC Council meeting organized in April, just early this year. One of the recommendations made during the Council meeting in April was that regarding the international fisheries related issues, our Council directors provided a guidance on the way forward on fishery subsidies for SEAFDEC to provide a platform. That's why we are providing our ASEAN member state and audience to know and to have a better understanding for facilitation discussion among ASEAN member states of SEAFDEC, including Japan, share updated information and develop, if we can, towards the common views to be reflected during the WTO negotiation, which was directed from our Council members. Also, SEAFDEC was tasked to extend or explore capacity building program for countries in the region on development of the reference points to define the key words in the WTO fishery subsidy negotiation document on with regard to overcapacity and overfishing. Let me give you objectives of this webinar. We have 2 times, today and next week. Today is open session where we have set up our objectives, including sharing, exchange views and ideas from international, regional and national. And also we would like to capture a key message and issues that our Southeast Asian countries can later on discuss and move, if possible, to develop ASEAN common views to reflect the issues that we discuss among ASEAN member states at international fora. And lastly, we would like to provide today webinar result information for consideration on next week webinar among our ASEAN member states and SEAFDEC members to discuss on the common views on the WTO fishery subsidy negotiation document. Here is our program for today on the 10th of June. We have from now about 2.5 hours. we will have our panelist speakers today from international agencies and also countries selected from our ASEAN and SEAFDEC member countries. Yes, our first speaker today, Madam Dr. Alice Tipping. She is lead Sustainable Trade and Fishery Subsidies at organization named International Institute for Sustainable Development, in short IISD. She has designed and lead highly respected programs of research and policy dialogues on trade and environmental issues, particularly on fishery subsidies, and she has a deep understanding and of the intersection of foreign policy, law, and environmental protection that's informed by roles and governments, and in managing policy relevant research. She was also our September last year, one of our speakers in our SEAFDEC webinar. Previous roles to IISD include Program Manager, Environment and Natural Resources for International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. She also Policy Advisor to New Zealand, Permanent Mission to UN in Geneva, Second Secretary and Legal Advisor to New Zealand Permanent Mission to the World Trade Organization or WTO. And she also Policy Advisor and Legal Officer at New Zealand Ministry Foreign Affairs and Trade. I think I would like to stop by now and start with our first speaker, Dr. Alice. We welcome Dr. Alice.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, Bangkok time. Thank you for the very kind introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to come back and speak to SEAFDEC member countries. Please let me know if for any reason the volume of my microphone is not sufficient. I have a headset if that is easier. I would like to share some slides, if that's okay, just to walk through. Here we are. Oh, can you see that well? Can you see the slides well?
Yes, now, yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, super. Well, thank you very much indeed. I thought that what would be most useful this morning, given that the objective of this session is to give you information that will help to think through for SEAFDEC member countries what might be a common position on this new revised text in the negotiations. I thought what would be most useful is if I walk through what we see as being some of the key elements of the new revised text that the chair has circulated, and what some of the key balances are that the chair has tried to strike, and also because these, I think, are the key questions for SEAFDEC member countries to think through. Essentially, to what extent are you comfortable with the balances in the text that the chair has tried to strike? And, you know, if you are comfortable, what would you like to support? And where you are not quite comfortable, what might you want to change? I should also just give one very small housekeeping apology in advance, which is that I'm working from home and I have my 2-year-old daughter also homesick. So I apologize if there are any interruptions because of her. I will walk through now then the key elements, at least as we see it, of the text that the chair has circulated. So you will probably remember from the last session and from reading the text, if you are familiar with it, that the chair has, well, the negotiations have essentially brought forth 3 main pillars of substantive rules. The first pillar, the first main substantive rule, is the idea that governments would be obliged to stop subsidizing a vessel or perhaps an operator if it is found to have been engaged in IUU, illegal, unreported, or unregulated fishing. So I'm going to walk through, I think, the balance that the chair tries to strike in this article. This is Article 3 in the draft text. So, you know, overall, the idea is that subsidies would be prohibited after an affirmative determination of IUU fishing. And that determination could be made by a coastal state member, or a flag state member for vessels flying its flag, or a relevant regional fisheries management organization. So the argument that has gone on behind this rule from the beginning essentially is, how much control does the determining member, the coastal state, have, and how much control does the subsidizing member have over this obligation? So the balance that the chair has tried to strike, and you'll see this in the provisions in Article 3, and looking at the bullet points in the middle of this slide, is that determinations can be made by coastal states or flag states, but they must be based on positive evidence and follow due process. Determinations by RFMOs must be made according to their own procedures. If they meet those requirements, they will trigger an obligation to remove subsidies from the offending vessel. But the subsidizing member also has quite a lot of control. So the subsidizing member can decide how long the prohibition of subsidies lasts for, depending on the severity of the infraction, for example. And there may be a minimum duration that they are obliged to remove subsidies for. So this essentially is the balance the chair is trying to strike in the two substantive provisions here. A relatively automatic prohibition of subsidies if due process is followed, but the subsidizing member can decide how long that prohibition applies for, and therefore how much effect it has. So key questions, I think, for SEAFDEC members: are you comfortable with that balance of control? A second key question: do you think the prohibition should apply to operators of the vessels as well as just the vessels themselves? And the arguments on both sides here are, some members say the prohibition should apply to subsidies given to operators, partly because some subsidies are given to operators, like tax deductions are generally given to the company that runs the vessel, while a fuel subsidy, for example, might be given to the vessel itself, essentially for the captain to apply for. So if you prohibit subsidies to operators, it has a potentially bigger effect, bigger impact, and a bigger deterrent factor. But other members argue, well, the operator isn't always responsible for the IUU fishing, right? It's more the captain of the vessel, perhaps. So there's an argument there about how strong the prohibition could be. So the third key question for SEAFDEC members is, what, if any, special and differential treatment should be allowed for developing country WTO members in the context of this prohibition? The chair's text suggests a 2-year transition period during which the prohibition would not apply to small-scale fishers that might be the subject of IUU determinations. And this is some members think there should not be any S&DT in this IUU provision. Some members think there could be space for some exemption for small-scale fishing, either on a permanent or a temporary basis. So those essentially, I think, are the three key decisions for SEAFDEC members in the forming of a common position on the IUU fishing part of the text. So the second, and I'm moving quite quickly to try and get a lot of content on the table, but I'm happy to come back and answer questions. So the second big pillar is the idea of prohibiting subsidies to fish stocks that are already declared to be overfished. And here, the chair's text has changed a lot since the previous text in December. And essentially what the chair has tried to do, I think, is to produce a suggested landing zone that balances the demand from some members for a very strict prohibition, because overfished fish stocks are particularly vulnerable, and the demand from others for more flexibility, because even if a stock is overfished, some members may keep subsidizing that fishing. So probably two key questions here. The first on the substantive provisions, the balance that the chair has proposed, again, looking at the two bullet points on the two sides, the first is that there would be quite a lot of deference to national and regional authorities about when a stock is overfished. So essentially, a stock would be overfished for the purposes of this discipline, the subsidies discipline, when a national authority or RFMO says so. It's not a complete deference though, because the national authority or RFMO would be asked to base the decision on the best evidence available to the authority. But once they make that decision, it is for them to take. But once they make that decision, subsidies to the fishing of that stock would be prohibited, except for subsidies that promote the rebuilding of that stock. So if it is a subsidy, perhaps for more selective fishing gear, for example, right, that allows juvenile fish to stay in the stock, if it is that kind of a subsidy would still be allowed, I think, because it promotes the rebuilding of the stock. So here the balance is a lot of deference to national authorities about when a stock is overfished, but quite a strict prohibition, right? The exception only applies to subsidies that promote the rebuilding of the stock. So the first question here for SEAFDEC members, are you comfortable with that balance? And the second big question, as for IUU, what, if any, exemptions, special and differential treatment for developing country members would be appropriate for this discipline, right? So in what circumstances do you think developing countries should be able to provide all subsidies to an overfished stock? And again, the chair has suggested the same idea as for the IUU discipline, the idea being that developing countries could keep providing all subsidies, even if a stock was overfished, for 2 years, but only to small scale fishing of that stock, not to big industrial scale fishing of an overfished stock, but only for 2 years. That at least is the way that he is proposing a landing zone, that there would be an exemption, but that it's time limited. So I think for me, those are the two key substantive questions for SEAFDEC members. Are you comfortable with that basic balance of obligations and exemptions? And do you think there should be S&DT? And if so, what? So those are the first two pillars, IUU and overfished stocks. The third big section, and this is in Article 5 of the text, covers the rules on prohibiting subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And here, one of the main balances in the text is in Article 5.1 and 5.11, if you have the text in front of you. And here, kind of looking at the two bullet points on each side, the idea in 5.1 is that there would be a prohibition of certain listed subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, such as vessel construction modernization, purchase of fuel, for example. But the big exemption here in 5.1.1 is that a member could still provide any of the subsidies listed in 5.1 if it shows that it has implemented measures to maintain stocks at a biologically sustainable level. So that I would argue, quite wide qualification is open to all members. And that's the first balance. And this, I mean, some members feel that 5.1.1 is just fine. Some members feel that it is too wide and allows too many potentially harmful subsidies to continue. Some members are also concerned about whether they could demonstrate, whether they could access 5.1.1. Could they really demonstrate that they have measures in place to maintain stocks at a biologically sustainable level? But that is one of the key balances in this Article 5. And so a question for SEAFDEC members, are you comfortable with that balance as the chair has proposed it? There are also important additional prohibitions in Article 5. This is in Article 5.2, 5.3, and 5.4. There is the idea that members would agree to prohibit subsidies contingent on, so linked to or tied to, fishing in areas beyond national jurisdiction. but there would be an exemption for this particular program for subsidized access rights, right? So if a government purchases access to another country's, to fishing in another country's EEZ and gives those access rights to its own fleet without recovering the cost, that is a subsidy, but that subsidy would be allowed as long as the fishery, again, has measures in place to keep it at a sustainable level. So, and there's another idea there about subsidizing fishing, prohibiting subsidies to fishing in the high seas outside the areas of competence of an RFMO. So there's a couple of ideas there about prohibiting subsidies in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Extremely important question here is the question of special and differential treatment, right? And this is where a lot of the discussion in Geneva is taking place. So the chair has included in his text, this is in Article 5.5, two alternatives for special and differential treatment for Article 5. The first alternative, Alternative 1, it comes from a proposal tabled by India many months ago and included in the chair's texts ever since. It's quite a wide proposal. It would allow a permanent exemption from the main prohibition for all subsidies provided by LDC members, for subsidies provided by developing members for fishing in their territorial sea, and subsidies provided by developing members for fishing in their EEZ or RFMO fisheries, if they, for developing countries that met a particular set of criteria. Now, under our calculations, this would essentially mean an exemption for developing country fishing subsidies to fishing in their EEZs for almost all developing countries, except for China and perhaps one or two Latin American countries, depending on the anchoveta catch levels. So that is the one alternative for SNDT in Article 5. The second alternative, Alternative 2, which is the chair's own proposal, would involve a permanent exemption for subsidies by LDCs, an exemption, perhaps time limited, for subsidies provided to low income and resource poor, more or less for small scale fishing by developing members within their territorial seas, so an artisanal small scale fishing subsidy exemption, and an exemption, perhaps more likely time limited, for subsidies provided by developing countries to fishing in their own EEZ. And the idea is that, as the chair proposes it, countries or members responsible for small shares of global catch and small amounts of subsidies could ask for extensions of these two time-limited exemptions. They would have to go to the subsidies committee or a committee at the WTO, and the exemption would have to be approved, which is a controversial idea, but the possibility would be there for them to be exempted, more or less indefinitely. So the question, I think, for SEAFDEC members, are you comfortable with the balance between 5.1 and 5.11, the main prohibition? Are you comfortable with one or other of these alternatives? And if so, would you, do you prefer one alternative over the other? What would you like to see changed? What SNDT do you think would be appropriate? In ensuring, I think, that we have SNDT that is appropriate and effective, helps developing countries meet their development interests, but in a sustainable way, ensuring that the agreement still has a meaningful impact on subsidy patterns. So those, I think, this is where a lot of the discussion in Geneva is focusing. A couple of sort of quick points on legal and institutional issues, and then I'll close. So one of the particularly interesting changes in the chair's text now is what he's suggesting on notifications and transparency. So the idea is that there would be some additional fishery-specific information that members must provide. So all members, in notifying their subsidies, must provide information on the type of fishing activity that is being subsidized and the catch data of the fishery that is subsidized. And to the extent possible, on a sort of best endeavors basis, they would also be required to provide information about stock status and the conservation measures they had in place for those stocks, to the extent they can. They would also be obliged to notify IUU determinations, so that all other members were on notice that the determination had been made. They would be obliged to notify any fishing access agreements that they had in force. So those would be the obligations of notification, some absolutely required and some best endeavors. And the interesting sort of additional piece of balance the chair has included is that members would be allowed to invoke or to apply essentially the exceptions in the text only with respect to subsidies they had notified. So no hiding your subsidies, and then later when they're challenged claiming that there was an exemption, you would have to notify them first. And you could, and the idea is members would be allowed to use exemptions that are based on fisheries management being in place only where they had actually notified the stock status and the management measures that they later wanted to rely on to ensure the subsidies could keep going. So essentially requiring transparency of members so that other members can see where subsidies are continuing and where members are relying on management measures to assess whether they're doing so appropriately. So this is another interesting question, I think, for SEAFDEC members. Are you comfortable with this kind of a balance? And personally, I think it's an interesting way of requiring information and requiring there to be some sort of, not always easy, but policy consideration and policy thought behind the fisheries management and the subsidization policies that are in place. So that has been a very quick run through. I will just mention that last week, in fact, we published a state of play brief on IISD's website, which walks through in a little bit more detail all of these examples, right? Walks through the various elements of the text and gives you a bit of an explanation about where they come from and how, at least as we read it, how the chair is trying to strike a balance between different provisions. I think my time is more than up, so thank you very much for your attention, and I would welcome questions or comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Alice. I think I'm one of the listener. I follow your 5 or 6 video clip on YouTube where you are providing information, basic and also some comprehensive the explanation on the fisheries subsidies issues on the WTO. I think a number of countries in the region is, how to say, we are a little bit far to meet the requirements that so much in detail. And I think I saw one question, I don't know, maybe better to, based on your experience, for example, the level of overcapacity, overfishing, in case the country can establish a reference, who will monitor or audit that kind of reference point in practice? Who will be the auditor, or who let's say if you have idea when implementing the WTO fishery subsidy agreement? Thank you.
Certainly, thank you. I mean, essentially, there will not be an audit of who maintains or sort of the measures in place to maintain stocks. But what would happen is that if a member government or member country wants to use, for example, the exemption in 5.1.1 to show that it implements measures to maintain stocks at a biologically sustainable level, it would need to notify the measures that it has in place to the committee that oversees this agreement, right? So if you did not want to provide any subsidies listed in 5.1 fuel or vessel construction modernization, you would not have to notify anything about your fisheries management. If you did want to provide some of the subsidies in 5.1, either you might be covered by the special and differential treatment rules. If you were not, and you wanted to use the exemption in 5.1, you would notify those measures to the WTO committee following this. And other members essentially would look at the measures that you had in place and perhaps ask questions in the committee. But there would not be an approval of the measures, there would not be an audit of the measures, but there would be transparency, and you might be asked to explain the measures that you had in place and perhaps why you thought they were effective. Eventually, if an issue ever got to a formal dispute process, then a WTO panel would look at whether you had measures implemented to maintain stocks. And it would look at what was notified and any further evidence that you put before it. But that's really if it got to a formal dispute, which, as we know, are very unusual. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you for that answer. I just have one technical question from my technical background. In order to rebuild the stock that overfished, that you mentioned, overfished stock is one of the key pillar that the WTO are looking at. In order to rebuild the stock of the overfished stock, I think it may take some time. However, the transferring or transmission period for 2 years is may not. I'm not sure how do they use these 2 years transition period for being fully implementing the agreement. What is the idea behind or not?
Sure, this is a good question. So first, perhaps to clarify the larger point, which is that this agreement, like any treaty, will eventually be open for, once it's approved, will be open for ratification by all WTO members. So WTO members each one will decide for themselves when they want to ratify the treaty, when they think they have in place measures to ensure they are compliant with the new obligations. So that may be 5 years after the treaty is concluded, it may be 10 years after the treaty is concluded. That is every government's own sovereign decision. Once the agreement is in force for a particular government, what Article 4 requires is that once you have decided that a stock is overfished, you would then have to, if you have harmful subsidies in place, you would have to shift those subsidies. If they were to fuel, for example, you might have to change the subsidy so it was not for fuel, but it was for income support, for example, to ensure that fishers could stay in the fishery for when it was eventually rebuilt. And that process could take as long as required, right? So as long as you have shifted your subsidies from subsidies that don't promote the rebuilding to subsidies that do promote rebuilding, you can then keep those rebuilding subsidies in place as long as you need until the fish stock has recovered. And then you can go back to subsidizing as you did previously, right? So it's just an additional requirement. Once a fish stock is declared to be overfished, the subsidies would have to shift until it is healthy again, and then the normal rules apply. I hope that applies a little bit. There are a couple of other questions in the Q&A, which I'm happy to take now, but I'm also conscious of time, so I'm in your hands.
Yes, I think for the time being, I think thanks for a while, and then we can come back under the Q&A questions. Thank you, Dr. Alice.
Thank you.
Yes, I would like to come to the next speaker for now. We have today afternoon Dr. Colin. He's an economic advisor, multilateral trade at the Commonwealth International Secretariat. He's the one responsible for monitoring and analyzing critical trade-related developments at multilateral level, and develop advice and recommendations for the benefits of the Commonwealth members, especially for small states, LDCs, and countries in sub-Saharan Africa. He is also responsible for advancing the Secretariat of the Commonwealth, applying the trade policy work in selected areas and disseminating information and findings strategically for maximum impact And before this, Dr. Colin served as the Commonwealth Geneva-based trade advisor involved in a wide range of activities designed to enhance negotiating capacities of Commonwealth small states on multilateral trade negotiation and their fuller integration into a global trading system. His activities include also identifying issues of interest and concern of these states in the economic and global trade landscape. He also providing technical assistance and enhancing contents and preparation of their concerns of the states and interest in the multilateral trade negotiation. I think he's very keen on trade and negotiation issues. He also served as a Commonwealth Economic Advisor. He's now based in London in the Office of the Chief Trade Advisor for Forum Island countries, where he also provides technical support and capacity building to FIC in their negotiations for the Pacific Agreement on closer economic relations, plus with Australia and New Zealand. I think we will welcome Dr. Colin on the floor for the next speaker. We welcome Dr. Colin. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wansha. And my apologies, my camera is playing up, so it's switching on and off. So I'm not quite sure what's the reason. But I would like to thank you for inviting me to this webinar. It's a very timely and a very important webinar. And I would like to also thank Alice for walking us through the text, which I think what I'm going to say would fit well in the layout which she has already presented. Basically, my presentation will be giving a developing country perspective, because I think the SEAFDEC has got developing country membership, and as well because of some of the most contentious issues in the current text are related to special and differential treatment. So I'll just throw you back. Let me share my screen, if possible. Thank you for sharing my screen. Next slide, please. Yeah, let me start by throwing back to reflect on the purpose of these negotiations. And we all understand that the negotiations aim to discipline the granting of subsidies harmful to sustainability provided to economic actors operating in the context of marine fisheries, which means inland fishing or freshwater fishing is not covered in this respect. And the focus, which largely emanates from SDG 14.6, is that there's need to discipline illegal unreported subsidies contribute to illegal unreported and unregulated fishing, subsidies that provide in the context of already overfished stocks, as Alice has already outlined in there, and subsidies that contribute to overfishing and capacity. And one fundamental aspect of these negotiations is to make special and differential treatment an integral part of the agreement. And like I said, I'm going to give you a developing country perspective, and I have to underscore that in many cases, developing countries do not have a harmonized position or harmonious view on most of the issues that are on the table. Next slide, please. Right, the consolidated text, which is currently on the table, is developed from a previous text, which include the Rev 1 and Rev 2 of the RDTNRL 126 documents. And the text, as it was presented by the chair suggest areas of compromise and provide new language for some provisions, which Alice has looked into critically and in detail, and in order to strike a balance or keep balances in some areas where negotiations are still very contentious. The text is square bracketed. The whole text is actually square bracketed, which meaning that nothing in the agreement in the text is agreed until everything is agreed. And it also littered with a number of brackets, square brackets, where further work is required. It also means that nothing outside the text is rejected. In other words, the issues that might have been discussed in Revs 1 and 2, some countries may want to bring them back into the text, or they might want to bring up new issues in the text, as I'll show later on in my presentation. The text is going to change depending on the final outcome. So this is not the final outcome, but it's going to change as negotiations unfold. The text is also based. The negotiations are also ongoing right now, and this means that this particular webinar is timely in terms of having an input into what is happening through, of course, your delegations. And it is in preparation for consideration by ministers on 15 July 2021. This is very important because I think in July 15, 2021, ministers will give direction as well as political guidance on how to conclude these negotiations. Next slide, please. What is the scope? Well, of course, the scope is, there are issues in the scope which members have got to deal with. For example, membership are not decided on whether the fisher subsidy disciplines will be a standalone agreement or an annex to the agreement of subsidies and countervailing measures. And this is my understanding that it has been left for a political decision to be made on that. There is also need to consider how the two relate. For example, we have to ask whether Article 1.1 of the SCM, whether it covers the breadth of the subsidies that are under discussions right now, because there are other subsidies which might not be under Article 1.1 of the agreement of subsidies and countervailing measures. And therefore, it is important to look at the link between the SCM and this current agreement and see whether a decision can be made to have it as a standalone agreement or as an annex. Next slide, please. I'll now go into the issues which are these clusters which are under discussions. And I think, like I said, Alice has done a wonderful job on this. So my job is relatively easy in that I'll be giving a developing country perspective in these particular clusters. There is a common understanding that IEU should not be subsidized. There is that understanding, but developing countries support the prohibition. Developing countries want in some exceptions of subsidies provided to artisanal fishing, subsistence fisheries, and the issue here, like Alice said, is that of the time. Should it be 2 years? And within 2 years, is there any possibility of this country having achieved their development objectives? And then the other issue, which is important to consider here, is that some developing countries might require support in monitoring their vast EEZs and in intercepting vessels involved in IEU, because they do not have some capacity in that respect. There is also need for greater cooperation to assist developing countries in identifying IUU IUU to help bolster their capacity and determine illegal fishing and effectiveness, and also help in the effectiveness of IUU subsidy disciplines. Like what Alice referred to about the objectivity of objective evidence, and this might not be beyond the capacity of some countries, and I would like to think that there is need for greater cooperation in that respect. There are many concerns in this particular cluster, which include, for instance, the list of determining entities in Article 3.2, including any possible overlap jurisdictions. I think Alice has covered this, but from a developing country perspective, they are not happy with the changes. Some countries are not happy with the changes and suggest a modification, such as the reintroduction of the footnote on overlapping IUU fishing determinations, or bringing back the brackets around flag state in 3.2b. I hope you've got the draft text in front of you so that you'll be able to, for easy reference to some of these paragraphs. So we have got countries which think it is not capturing the issues they really want in the text, and therefore suggesting bringing back some aspects from the previous text. And the other issue which Alice dealt with is that of due process, and I'm not going to elaborate on that because she has done a good job on that. And then there is the issue of the automaticity of the subsidy prohibition based on affirmative determination of IUU fishing. The automaticity of the subsidy prohibition based on IUU fishing determination. Some members seek proportionality in the sense of discretion for this subsidizing member to decide whether or not to apply the subsidy prohibition based on its own consideration of the seriousness of the infraction. Others consider the current text of Article 3.4 appropriate because it would ensure that the subsidy prohibition would always apply whenever there is affirmative EU determination. I think when Alice was walking us through this, she clearly articulated these issues. Next slide, please. When it comes to the cluster on prohibition of subsidies concerning fished stocks, I think there is a common agreement, understanding that the fishing of overexploited species should not be subsidized. And developing countries support this, but they are also concerned about exemptions in terms of their artisanal fishing and subsistence fishing. And the issue also is related, like in the IUU, is related to the period which is being transition period, which is being suggested, which is of 2 years. There is, I would like to think that there is need for greater cooperation to assist developing countries in the assessment of levels of depletion to improve accuracy and to avoid misuse of cases of dispute settlement. That this is in some cases where countries struggle to assess the depletion of stocks. It is also critical to avoid situations where only those countries with the capacity to regularly assess fish stocks benefit from agreed provisions. That's why it is also important to cooperate in this respect. Next slide, please. Now we come on to the prohibition on subsidies concerning overcapacity and overfishing. I think this is where much of the there's a lot of work to be done in this respect. But developing countries maintain that the subsidies prohibition should apply to all developed countries for care of fishing, and to developing countries' large industrial fishing fleet in their EEZs and in high seas as well. And developing countries are also looking for an outcome that gives them meaningful policy space to develop fishing fleet and overall capacity, including for the processing capacity to enable value addition. In other words, their concerns are developmental oriented. They want to, subsidies, disciplines should not preclude them from pursuing their developmental goals. Some developing countries will argue that, the sustainability flexibility, which is provided in Article 5.11, would enable the status quo of subsidization. In other words, nothing will change. Next slide, please. Now, if you go to the criteria which is in that particular cluster, which also Alice has alluded to, you will see that I've just tried to bring up the criteria that is reflected on the screen there, one from India and the other one from a number of group of countries, which was put together by the chair. But there is the view that is expected that the provision, for example, alternative one, there have been issues with regards to the per capita GNI per capita in terms of some countries not benefiting, and I would like to think most small island developing states, particularly in the Caribbean, which has got a high GNI per capita, might be excluded from that. And the view expressed under this particular alternatives that the provision would provide a de facto permanent carve-out for many members. So some countries are not happy with that. And then alternative two, I think the concern that this provision would excuse from the disciplines or developing members, including those that are major subsidizers. So there is still a lot considerable work to be done on this particular aspect. And while it is imperative to ensure that developing countries that are big subsidized do not slip through the net and of the net of the new disciplines, there is thereby undermining their effectiveness. In other words, the provisions should be in such a way that the big developing countries that are subsidizers should not slip through the net and continue to subsidize. It is also essential that developing country members that have minimal impact on the fishing and overcapacity are not unduly restricted because of the set criteria. Next slide, please. Now, I'll briefly talk about the issues on the technical assistance and capacity building. Generally, I think developing countries think that technical assistance and capacity building should be largely in terms of support in the implementation of the instruments. And of course, assistance in the terms of strengthening stock assessment and in terms of developing their fisheries sectors. And however, they do not support any provision that would bring their fisheries management under WTO scrutiny, of course. And technical support assistance is also, technical assistance is also left to countries that can have got the ability or are able to do so. And this might mean less resources or inadequate resources, which might be difficult to secure and making challenging for most developing countries to pursue ambitious implementation agenda. In other words, the very fact that technical assistance is left to members who can provide such a technical assistance, it kind of make it less accessible, and it might affect the ability of countries to implement the agreement. Next slide, please. Issues of transparency and notification. I think developing countries support the need for appropriate transparency provisions. Requirements should not be burdensome. That's the argument that is coming, given their limited capacity and resources. And also consideration should be given to developing differential notification procedures where enhanced notification and transparency obligation apply to members fishing countries and prime contributors to capacity, overcapacity and overfishing, rather than with small fishing capacity. Overall, when I looked at the particular suggestions by the chair, I think there is a concern in terms of burdensome on the transparent requirements, and that could hinder the process of invoking flexibilities for developing countries, especially those in the special and differential treatment. However, some other developing countries kind of welcome enhanced transparent provision. And like I said earlier on, not every developing country are on the same page. They tend to differ with provision to provision. Next slide, please. Now we look at the issues on the final provisions. I've skipped the issues on institutional arrangement because I think these are issues which really depend on what would have been, whether it is going to be a standalone agreement or it's going to be an annex. That's when a decision might be made on that. And now if we look at the final provisions, there are important issues in there, in that nothing shall prevent a country from granting subsidies for disaster relief. I'll dwell on this point in the next slide. Fish stocks reduction can be due to storms, for example, and earthquakes, which can change the benchmark of subsidies on overfished stock. This might not, the stock might not be result of subsidies that contribute to overfishing, but this can be a result of natural disasters, natural occurrences. And disasters also affect the fisheries business directly and indirectly through the destruction of boats, gears, and offshore infrastructure, which have been listed in Article 5, and some governments may want to subsidize in that respect, so that for recovery purposes. The idea to include special exemptions of disaster-related subsidies from all or some of the disciplines attract consensus. In other words, this particular issue of granting subsidies for disaster relief, there is a general understanding that it is a good thing to do. However, next slide, please. However, what is not clear is whether this should be achieved via scope exemption of the entire set of disciplines or specifically linked to disciplines on overfishing and overcapacity and possibly overfished stock. That's an area which has to be made clear. And developing countries might, there's a possibility that different countries might benefit if general exemptions for small players as proposed by ACP group, if that is granted, then small players can benefit. And the other issue which you have to consider is that the WTO members are also grappling on how much flexibility such exemptions should provide. And if subsidies are seen only in the context of capacity or efforts enhanced, then there's a possibility solution could be prohibiting equipping fishermen who lost their boats to storms with better, stronger, safer boats, which seems inadequate. In other words, after a disaster and the fishing industry is going to be subsidized, then there is need to make sure that there's no enhancement in the type of equipment which they are provided. It's not new equipment which can increase overfishing, or it has to be within the confines of the current instruments. Any limitations on subsidies, I would like to think within the exemptions for disaster relief, and reliance must cover all that is reasonably necessary to respond or prepare for disaster, and should cover all subsidies deemed useful. And I think this is important, and because of the process of notification, then some other members will know exactly what subsidies has been given. Now, the current, I'll now turn to the next slide, please. I'll now turn to the current discussions after the chairman's text, what exactly is at stake. I think the issue of special and differential treatment, as I mentioned, there's need for an overall balance in the text, and some developing countries are of the view that special and differential treatment in the current text is too narrow and rigid, and pointing to the conditions for accessing it, time limits on it. And some of these members are advocating broader carve-outs without time or geographic limitations for developing and LDC members. Many are arguing that there should be no links between special and differential treatment provisions and the transparency and notification provisions, with some considering these too burdensome. Some other developing members consider some of the special and differential treatment provisions too broad and do not necessarily support any. Some countries do not necessarily support any S&D in the IUU and overfished stock pillars. With regards to notification and transparency provisions, I think most developing countries have demonstrated that there's need to demonstrate that the operational details of the subsidy programs, sustainability criteria, stock assessment, whether these are too burdensome for developing countries or not. And then the issues of EU fishing determination, as elaborated by Alice, are also still contentious. And there's also the issues of the treatment of subsidies to distant water fishing, to vessels not flying the flag of the subsidizing member, and some countries are still concerned about that. And then the issues of course, of territoriality. The provisions need to be crafted carefully, as WTO should not be making decision on territorial issues. That's the argument that is coming out. And then there is some interesting developments as well, in that the United States has submitted a new proposal, which was circulated on the 27th of May. And this particular submission is looking into issues of harmful subsidies in relation to the use of forced labor, and the explicit recognition of the problem and the need to eliminate it. So there is, like I said earlier on, that new issues might be brought into this particular text. Now, next slide, please. Now, if I'm to reflect on what is on the table and how everything is going to bear forward, I think all countries have got the same common understanding that disciplining fishery subsidies will help rescue the collapse of the global fishing stocks and preserve the environment and improve food security and livelihood globally. This is an understanding by all members. And what is coming from Geneva is that there is not much movement in the narrowing of the remaining gaps in the current text. And if that's the case, then it means that it might not be possible to present it to the ministers on the 15th of July. And I think it is important that the negotiations are ongoing, and SEAFDEC can have an input through its membership in terms of, building consensus and compromises within the current negotiations. And the presentation of bracket text at the possibility of a presentation of a bracket text at 15 July will mean that ministers will have to negotiate to find compromise, and this is near impossible, really. And I think there's a possibility of probably, ministers just meeting and giving further guidelines and time frame for the conclusion of these negotiations. Thank you. I think that I've come to an end. Thank you very much for your listening.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Colin. Sorry, just a moment. Okay, sorry for technical disturb. I have saw one comment, very common. Can I answer that? The stock assessment for the highly migratory species, is that IFMO responsible for that species taking care of the stock assessment? I think yes, but actually I see a number of difficulties as far as SEAFDEC has experience in doing assessment of the stock migratory, highly migratory species stock assessment in our SEAFDEC member countries. Is not that easy, but let's see what will happen. But the answer is yes. I think IFMO should taking care of those resources which is the highly migratory species in nature, such as tuna, for example. I think Dr. Colin has raised some additional issues from Dr. Alice earlier. He also touched upon on 15 July possibility to have some take some time to compromise things, gaps in the text. And I received one question is very interesting for, I think not only for Dr. Colin but also for Dr. Alice. Can I ask both of you on as Dr. Alice mentioned earlier, that this is a treaty and it's up to the country to ratify or not. Let's say a country decided not to ratify this agreement, for example, meaning that the country is free to maintain their subsidies programs, whatever situation of their stock are. The WTO will put any trade sanction to that country or not? And what is the weightage for the country to ratify this agreement? I would like to put this to, I don't know, difficult or easy to answer. Maybe we start from Dr. Alice. Are you here?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the question. In fact, I have just typed a response in the Q&A, but for the purpose for everyone's benefit, I mean, essentially, my understanding is that it is possible that a WTO member might choose not to ratify this agreement. Not all WTO members have ratified the trade facilitation agreement, right, which was agreed back in 2014. I was just checking the numbers, and 154 WTO members have ratified the trade facilitation agreement, which is 10 shy of the total. And then the question is, what are the consequences of not ratifying? Now, to my understanding, there are no formal legal consequences of not ratifying unless there is a specific decision taken under Article 10.3 of the Marrakesh Agreement, which puts an extra weight of incentive on countries to ratify an amendment to the Marrakesh Agreements, which is what this would be. Assuming that there is no specific decision taken, and I don't think there was in the context of the Trade Facilitation Agreement, assuming that there is no specific decision taken to really incentivize signing up to the treaty, there would be no formal, as far as I am aware, no formal legal consequence of not ratifying. That said, countries may want to encourage each other to ratify the agreement. I mean, the WTO as an organization does not encourage or impose sanctions. I mean, I think it is, I think for the vast majority of I cannot think of a SEAFDEC member who would be large enough in the scheme of things to be the subject of any kind of hostile trade action for non-ratification of this agreement, but that is just my own perspective. So I suspect it is more likely to be encouragement, offers of technical assistance, kind of political encouragement to ratify the agreement, if anything. And then the question is, what is the incentive? I mean, I think the incentive is partly a demonstration of support for the multilateral trading system, support for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which every head of state has signed up to. I think it's a demonstration of a willingness to take a coherent approach to the management of fisheries and to find space within the agreement to move forward in making policy more coherent. Every member will have, as they always do with every treaty, what the Europeans would call a margin of appreciation. Every government will decide, when they look at the rules, how they want to change their domestic legislation to be compliant with the new rules. And every government will decide to do that a little bit differently. So, you know, I think there should be enough flexibility in the rules themselves and in the way governments interpret them for virtually any government to find a way to shift its subsidy patterns, even over the course of several years, such that they can feel comfortable ratifying the agreement. I think there's important kind of political and substantive reasons why governments would want to ratify the agreement. You know, also because, and I know that this is something that Dr. Ngozi, the Director General, is working on already, there's a lot of discussion, at least in Geneva, about the technical assistance that would be available to countries to implement the agreement, both the subsidy reform elements and the fisheries management elements. So there is already an active discussion in Geneva about the support that could be provided once countries, or to ratify, and once countries have ratified the agreement. I hope that answers a little bit, and maybe I'll leave it to Colin to answer the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. I think you've basically covered much of the ground in that respect. But I just want to just highlight that at times some countries will just you know, sit back to see how it works out before they decide to ratify. And even in any other agreement, some countries don't, you know, jump in and be part to the agreement. And even the WTO, some members are still acceding to the WTO. It took a while for China to do so. It took some other countries time to do so. So this way, it can be a learning curve for some countries in terms of how the instrument is working, how effective it is. So it's up to the members to make sure that whatever agreement comes out has got to be effective in terms of disciplining subsidies on fisheries, because every country is agreeable that this is a good thing to do in terms of both livelihoods, economic development, in terms of food security, in terms of environment protection. And I would like to think the incentives which Alice has talked about, for instance, technical assistance, are very critical in terms of, influencing countries to decide whether to ratify or not, especially developing countries, because they might see it as burdensome, as some might want maybe just to go with what they are doing right now in terms of maybe providing fishing licenses. They find it maybe easier than, so there is need for greater cooperation in this respect to ensure that all members ratify the agreement. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, both of you. I think very clear, and I think our member countries can have ideas how impact or in effect from the ratifying or not to ratify. Just before we move to next speaker, I would like to ask both of you. There's one interesting question. If the resources are overlap between, I think, more than 2 states, so the stock assessment it's required collaborative efforts to do stock assessment. So it's not that easy to implement in the real world. So how to say, for example, in case of Thailand, they develop a kind of multi-species stock assessment program where they can apply for the quota number of fishing days per year, for example, while our neighboring country, for example, Cambodia, they have really far away from Thailand, for example, but the resources are sharing. One species, for example, migrating between Thai border to Cambodian EEZ, to Vietnam, so those kind of things may happen. How to say, how to deal with such issues on transboundary species in terms of not only resources used or utilized by single states. Can we start from Dr. Alice?
Certainly, thank you. I was just trying to quickly look up the UN Fish Stocks Agreement because, I think the first point to make, I think, is that by express design and express agreement among WTO members, this WTO Treaty on Subsidies is not going to change the way fisheries management responsibilities are allocated, right? I mean, all WTO members have been very clear, this is not meant to impose a WTO scrutiny on members' stock assessment decisions or on members' IUU determinations, which remain as a matter of national law, for example. RFMOs will make a decision based on their own internal processes, and that decision will stand. So there is a real a desire to respect the way that fisheries management decisions are currently made. So I think, for example, with respect to, this is my understanding, right? So with respect to a stock that might be migrating between various different EEZs, it would be the stock assessment decision of each particular coastal state that applies with respect to the fishing of the stock in that EEZ. So I mean, I'm originally from New Zealand. I will use the New Zealand example. If there was a stock migrating between New Zealand and Australia and back again, and New Zealand decided that the stock was overfished with respect to the stocks as it existed in its waters, then the WTO agreement on subsidies for overfished stocks would apply to the fishing of that stock in New Zealand's waters. If Australia made a different decision, Australia decided it wasn't overfished, then the agreement would not be triggered with respect to the fishing of the stock in Australia's waters. Now, is that slightly inconsistent? Yes, it is. But the WTO agreement does not pretend to impose or to oblige countries to change their fisheries management decisions. If the subsidies agreement applies differently in different places, that is because it reflects the fisheries management decisions taken in different places. So I hope that responds at least to the example provided. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Please, Dr. Colin.
Yeah, if I can jump in as well, I think from the legal aspect, I think Alice has put it very clearly that this agreement is not about fisheries management, and I'm just like the example which she has given of Australia and New Zealand, and what I could draw from that is that countries and RFMOs should actually cooperate in terms of, overfished stocks. If New Zealand realizes that the stock of tuna is depleting in the New Zealand waters and not in Australian waters, and New Zealand talks about this with Australia to say, look, this is a migratory species which comes to your waters and our waters and it's depleting. How best can we handle this? So there's need for greater cooperation outside this agreement itself in terms of how to manage fisheries. So despite management being part of this, but it is equally important for members to look into that and reflect into that in terms of they can handle it outside the agreement, but in terms of general fisheries management. Thank you.
Yes, thank you both of you. I think very clear answer from our speaker. Alice, you like to say something? Yes.
Forgive me, I just wanted to add, because there's another question that's just been added in the question and answer about what would happen about if there is an overlap between a coastal state and a relevant RFMO. Now, again, my understanding is that some RFMOs have been granted the ability, the governance power to make stock assessment decisions with respect to an entire stock, whether it migrates including a stock that migrates from the high seas into EEZs and then out again, and tuna is the classic example. So my understanding is if a coastal state is part of an RFMO and has granted to the RFMO as part of its accession to the RFMO treaty, if it has granted to the RFMO the mandate to make a decision about whether a stock is overfished on the high seas or in its EEZ, then the subsidy obligation, it accepts that the subsidy obligation is triggered by that RFMO's decision. In the same way that it would accept that its fishing management measures, it accepts the conservation measures that the RFMO decides, right, under the RFMO's mandate. So again, what this agreement would do is to add a subsidy obligation on top of the obligations governments have already accepted with respect to their membership of an RFMO. So if they have accepted the RFMO has a mandate to make stock assessment decisions, my understanding at least is that under this agreement, the subsidy obligation could also be triggered by a stock assessment decision made by that RFMO, if the party has agreed to accept that stock assessment decision, if it's a party to the RFMO or I think they're called cooperating non-contracting parties. But here I'm getting into the depths of fisheries management law. That's my understanding, but I see Colin smiling. If you'd like to add anything or correct me, please go ahead, Colin.
No, not anything to add. I'm just smiling because you just hit it correctly on the nail correctly. I think that's how it should be from my own understanding as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for both of you. I think we let Dr. Alice and Colin take a rest for a while, and please listen to the views from some of our member countries. We will start from our member countries, from Japan. Just a moment. Okay. Yes, our next speaker, Mr. Miyauchi, he also was one of our speaker last webinar in September last year. He is currently Assistant Director of Fishery Products Trade Office in Japan under Fisheries Agency. He obtained his Bachelor on Fishery Science from Seafood Development Faculty of Fisheries, the University of Hokkaido. He worked at first Secretary in charge of FAO at Embassy of Japan in Italy. Then he started work as the Assistant Director with the under the Fisheries Agency of Japan since the year 2012. Now we are welcome our speaker from Japan. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you giving me the floor. I would like to be very brief. I'd like to just let me share the main article regarding the text. The first, scope. Japan supports the draft text of scope, except Article 1.2. 1.2 is a non-specific fuel subsidy in the scope. Japan is concerned that, and Japan cannot accept this idea. Fuel subsidies are one type of fishery subsidies and should be treated in the same manner as the other types of subsidies. The WTO subsidies rule have been applied to subsidies with specificity in the meaning of Article 2 of SCM agreement. Japan is of the view that fishery subsidies rule under WTO should follow this principle as well. Otherwise, it would affect the economy world policy setting, including tax regime of the member, which goes beyond the field that WTO should cover. The next, the prohibition of subsidy to IUU pillar. Japan generally supports the Chair's draft text of IUU. And regarding SDT of IUU, Japan believes it unnecessary to have SDT in IUU pillar because our mandate clearly requires us to prohibit subsidies to IUU fishing. If WTO sends a signal that some developing members can contribute to provide subsidies to IUU vessels, even for short limited periods, it would lose trust of our outside stakeholders. And thirdly, prohibition on subsidies concerning overfished stocks. Japan is of the view that Article 4.3, Japan supports the basic structure of Article 4 in the Chair's revised text. Article 4 consists of the prohibition of Article 4.1 and the sustainability-based flexibility of Article 4.3. Japan is of the view that Article 4.3 is essential if we maintain the prohibition of Article 4.1. Having said that, the revised text of Article 4.3 has deleted the terms and or other appropriate measures, which was included in the previous Chair's text. Japan considers this revision inappropriate. In order to rebuild fish stocks currently in the state of overfished, many countries, including Japan, oblige fishermen to complying many rebuilding measures as a requirement for receiving subsidies. this helps promote the implementation of restoring measures and enables overfished stocks to recover effectively. Therefore, Japan would like to request to include the term other measures for stock recovery in the conditional clause of Article 4.3, in addition to subsidies. And 5, prohibition of subsidies concerning overcapacity and overfishing pillar. Japan welcomes that the revised text has retained Article 5.1 and 5.11, so-called hybrid approach. Japan believes that structure strikes a right balance between the prohibition and flexibility without lowering the level of ambition of this negotiation. Japan hopes that hybrid approach helps members implement fisheries subsidies in a manner that promotes sustainable fishing through proper fisheries policy measures. And Japan do not think it is necessary to a geographic limitation on Article 5.11 and footnote 10. Japan is willing to explore special and differential treatment for Article 5.11. We believe this may also contribute to the bridge the gap on SDT on Article 5, where members are still divided between a permanent carve-out and very strict timeline. And Japan supports Article 5.2a. 5.2a covers subsidies contingent upon tied to fishing beyond national jurisdiction. The subsidies fall under Article 5.2a gives support on conditions that eligible fisheries do fishing beyond national jurisdiction. In our view, such subsidies strongly incentive fishing beyond national jurisdictions while shifting fishing pressure from area within national jurisdiction to areas outside of national jurisdiction. Instead of reducing the domestic fishing capacity, as a result, fishing beyond its own jurisdiction is exposed to more fishing capacity pressure than the case no such subsidies exist, and that makes RFMO's fisheries management more difficult. And regarding SDT on OCOF, Japan is concerned that developing members who are big fishing nations can utilize the SDT in Article 5 only for the reason that they recognize themselves as developing members. From that perspective, 2 criteria used in alternative 2 might be useful over Article 5.5. Also on this point, alternative 2 uses share of the annual global volume marine capture fish production and the amount of subsidies as threshold. Of course, the specific member in 2 thresholds are the issue of coming negotiation. In any case, we cannot accept the situation where big developing members enjoy SDT. We are not satisfied with a permanent carve-out for LDC members in Article 5.5, Alternative 2. On the other hand, finding the right balance between effectiveness of this discipline and development status is necessary. We are open to have a discussion on how we can best address difficulties LDC members have in coming discussions. And finally, I'd like to touch upon notification and transparency, Article 8. Japan supports strong linkage, notification and transparency with 3 main pillars, namely IUU, OFS, OCOF, in particular OCOF. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you, Japan. Mr. Miyauchi, very comprehensive and straightforward forward on the issues and in the specific article. I'm not sure my understanding is correct or not. In case a state has disagree in any particular article and agree in particular article, is that possible to ratify some part of it, not the whole agreement or not?
If my understanding is correct, I think it's impossible just to agree with the whole text or not. That's my understanding. Not partially.
Okay, I think I got it. The interesting is that the position of Japan will be further discussed among us SEAFDEC member countries next week. I think interesting to hear views from other, but however, I think the chance here is that we have special speaker here, Dr. Alice and Dr. Colin, who are very keen in negotiation process. I think this agreement has been discussed for over 20 years and it's not easy to end by July, as mentioned by Dr. Colin a while ago. Mr. Miyauchi, if you have any things to ask to Dr. Colin and Dr. Alice, because we have only today a chance to have both of them with us. Next week, we have only our member states. In case you have any interesting point to raise and to ask them to clarify for Japan, is welcome. And also welcome to our member countries. As announced earlier, if in case of not our panelists, but our member countries would like to say something, please raise your hand in the function of the participants for the raise hand. If Miyauchi-san, if you have any questions or any points to ask our speakers, Dr. Colin and Dr. Alice, please welcome. Or Ms. Jung or our colleague from SEAFDEC member countries, if you have, because we have a chance only today. We have special guests from IISD and Commonwealth. Thank you. Before, or you have questions to Japan, is that okay? Allowed.
No. Because I already checked IISD the kind of video often, so far I don't have any question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Miyauchi-san. Okay, Madam Yung, are you okay? You don't have any specific questions so far? Okay, I think our colleague from Philippines would like to ask something, please.
First and foremost, I would like to thank SEAFDEC for organizing this very important event. And of course, I'm very glad to see colleagues of mine, Alice Tipping, who has been a very good friend of mine and a colleague in the negotiation at the time that she was part of the New Zealand negotiating team, and also our chairperson for the Friends of Fish then. I don't know if there's still Friends of Fish, if I could say that. But just going back to our, of course, I also would like to thank Dr. Collins for the presentation based on the Commonwealth perspective of the negotiation. But I would just like to get back to our friend from Japan. Just a clarificatory question. I heard him, in the longest period that I have been involved in the negotiation, I think this would be the first time that I would have somehow agree with the Japan position that there seems to be too much flexibility for developing countries. But if I would quote, Japan's or our friend from Japan mentioned that they don't think, quote unquote, developing countries need flexibility, or I also rephrased that. I would just like to clarify if Japan would give special dispensation for fisheries within 12 nautical miles, which we have been advocating in the WTO, so that this is not necessarily a developing country issue, but perhaps also a developed country issue. Our direction is to prohibit in general subsidies outside 12 nautical miles. And let's avoid these lengthy debates whether it's low income or resource poor, or whether it's artisanal or subsistence. For us, the territorial waters, sovereign countries should have sovereign rights to, to practice whatever sovereignty they have, including the flexibility to subsidize within 12 nautical miles. So going back to Japan, I would like to know if, assuming that it's only available for developing countries, the 12 nautical miles, if Japan would agree that any fishing within 12 nautical miles only, provided that it can be enforced and clear in the rules, would Japan be agreeable to that? Thank you.
Thank you, my colleague of Philippines. Actually, Japan, EU, Korea, and Taiwan submitted the proposal named RD/TN/RL/112/Rev.1. Regarding 12 nautical miles, for developing and LDC members, I repeat, LDC members to which the agreed transitional periods are applicable, subsidies granted to vessels flying exclusively in the territorial sea up to a limit not exceeding 12 nautical miles of the territorial baseline of these members would be deemed not to be prohibited during such periods. So we propose that the exclusion of 12 nautical miles, but it's only transitional periods. So that's our proposal, but it depends on current negotiation, of course. Do I answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yes, thank you, Miyauchi-san. I think we have quite a limited time, but we have very similar to my thought. One of our attendees asking Japan the view from Japan on the scope under Article 1.2 to have exemption for other fishing related activities on shore. What's can you elaborate a bit more, because not so clear to me and one of please.
I said that the non-specific subsidies, including I said that the non-specific subsidies, including fuel subsidies, should not cover the WTO fisheries subsidies agreement, because as I said, the WTO subsidies rule have been applied to subsidies with specificity in the meaning of Article 2 of the SCM agreement. So if we agree that kind of including non-specific subsidy too, it is unprecedented, and it's not good. We don't accept that kind of unprecedented case. So that's our official stance. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Japan, for your clarifications. I think for the sake of time, we should move to our next speaker. Our next speaker, we are having our colleague from Thailand, Ms. Jariya. Ms. Jariya, she is an economist from Fisheries Development Policy and Planning Division of the Department of Fisheries, Thailand. She's holding a bachelor and master on economic faculty from Kasetsart University. She is specialized in analyzing international fish trade for the Department on Fish Trade Situation and Data Information. Also, she is disseminating fish trade information for the country and monitoring requirements and regulations on fishery products. She is also experienced in giving opinions on fishery trade issues, including FTA, RTA, and multinational trade negotiation, and participated in fishery subsidy negotiation meetings, so on and so forth. I think we welcome Ms. Jariya on her talk this afternoon. Please.
This afternoon, SEAFDEC Secretariat and all participants. Before starting my presentation, as a Thai representative, I would like to express my appreciation to SEAFDEC for holding the webinar on WTO fisheries subsidy to enhance understanding on fisheries subsidy and to open a forum for us to exchange views and concern on it. Thailand would like the WTO fisheries subsidy discipline to achieve its goal in accordance with the mandate of MC11 and UN SDG 14.6 by striking a balance between the effective discipline on harmful subsidy and the policy space needed for developing members. In this connection, I would like to share Thailand's view with regards to WTO fisheries subsidy negotiation upon the 3 pillars. Which should be put my presentation on the screen, please. Next presentation, please. Next, please. Today, I will focus upon this 3 pillars. IUU fishing pillar, overfished stock pillar, and OFOC. And then we will talk about the exemption for the small fisheries and SDG. For the IUU fishing pillar, we are well aware that IUU fishing has been the main cause of overcapacity and overfishing, resulting in the fishery resource deterioration. Until now, not a single member has expressed a desire to subsidize IUU fishing in the negotiations. Next slide, please. Thailand has prioritized the combating IUU fishing at national agenda since 2015. Thailand has a comprehensive reform of the fishery sector and improved a legal framework to be consistent with the international agreement and to follow the goals of the negotiation to eliminate subsidy that contribute to IUU fishing. As IUU fishing has been agreed worldwide to be eliminated, in this way, the strict discipline on fisheries subsidy should be developed to effectively prevent subsidy to IUU fishing. Thailand agreed with the current share text that prohibit members to provide subsidy to IUU fishing, which are determined by only 3 entities, namely fact state, quarter state, or RFMO, including host state and subsidizing member. These are appear in Article 5.2. And to the overfished stock pillar, next slide, please. Yes, according to the current share text, members are not allowed to subsidize IUU fishing or fishing-related activity regarding on overfished stock, except only those promoting the rebuilding of the stock to a sustainable level. Thailand recognizes that fishery resource management is a key factor to restore and maintain fish stock at a sustainable level. In implementation of measures such as the control of fishing effort and the fishing capacity through setting an annual catch quota or limiting fishing days and the number of fishing vessels based on a sustainable level together with other fishery resources enhancements in conservation measures. This will ensure restoration and sustainability of fish stocks. Fisheries subsidy under the fisheries subsidy under a good fishery management will prevent a negative effect to fish resources. Thailand is of the view that the development of discipline on fishery subsidies should underscore the importance of fisheries management. We consider that members should be allowed to subsidize in this context if appropriate fishery management measures are implemented to ensure rebuilding of the stock at a sustainable level. Next slide, please. For the view on the overcapacity and overfishing pillar, Thailand support provision of subsidy contribute to OCOF, essential yet very complicated for negotiation. If the member could compromise to conclude this pillar, this would be a very important step towards the accomplishment of the negotiation. As I mentioned in the OFS pillar, that the fishery resource management is crucial to sustainability of fish stocks, and Thailand support the overcapacity and overfishing discipline that recognize the important role of the fishery management. Now the current chair text has already reflected the required sustainability elements, so that Thailand has no objection to the hybrid approach developed by the chair for OCOF provisions mixed between risk approach and sustainability-based approach as a compromise landing zone for members. Moreover, Thailand strongly believes that the wording identified in Article 5.1.1 could be accepted by all members, not giving a reverse SDG or a large carve out to big subsidizer, which render the agreement ineffective as concerned by some WTO members. As subsidizing members have the burden of proof to ensure that the effective measures are implemented to maintain fish stock at a sustainable level. In the meantime, the provision is accessible to all members with the fisheries management and allow the policy space for members to provide necessary subsidy for the development of the fisheries sector. As members are not only required to apply the sophisticated scientific data, such as MSY, they could also use the alternative reference points. Moreover, underscoring the fishery management in this important pillar, we encourage all members to develop or improve their fishery management to respond to the mandates of the negotiations and to achieve the ultimate goal of maintaining fish resources sustainability. Next slide, please. Here are the exemption for additional fisheries. Thailand views that the additional fisheries in Thailand are not different from those of ASEAN SEAFDEC member countries, whose lives mainly rely on additional fishing and avenue level. In the context of Thailand, additional fishing is a fishing operation undertaken in coastal areas by small vessels with low effective gears or without a vessel. In addition, additional fishing is not root cause or contributions of OCOF or put any negative impact on the sustainability of fisheries resources. In the year 2020, Thai additional fishing vessels have been accounted for more than 80% of the total fishing vessels, while the catch volume from additional fisheries was less than 20% of total capture marine production. Therefore, discipline on fisheries subsidy on the pillar of overfished stock and overfishing and overcapacity should not be interfered with and affect the livelihood of artisanal fishing to maintain their career security and safeguard their way of life. Next, please. Next, please. For the SDT, overall, Thailand would like to have an appropriate SDT for the developing and less developed countries, focusing on the transition period, technical assistance, and capacity building to ensure that members could adapt and implement the fishery subsidy discipline. This is Thailand overview and concern on the WTO subsidy negotiations. And Thailand wishes that the member could conclude the negotiation of fishery subsidy by July 2021. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Thailand. Very straightforward and hit to the point that what the article Thailand are in line with the text of the chair. And again, Ms. Jariya, she touched a bit on the artisanal fishing and small scale kind of fishing in for your information, small scale fishing sector in this region is considered very important in terms of livelihood, and she mentioned the career security and those kind of earning from fishing incomes is very important to many of them. More than 50% of the people are involving in small scale. It's not easy to determine or put the determination, the qualification, what is the meaning or definitions of small scale. Even only 10 member countries in SEAFDEC, we have also difficulties in determining the meaning of the small scale, because one country may have a different definition to another one. So I think this will be the issue again in the WTO. I'm not sure, I never involved in the meeting, but will be a big issue, because I observe many issues are settled because we have the international instruments of FAO. We have the UNCLOS, for example, to deal with the overlapping areas or the area of the regional fisheries management organization. Okay, thank you, Kun Jariya. I think so far we can, according to the time, we move to the next. My good friend from Vietnam, always, Madam Nguyen Chinh Chang Yung, Directorate of Fisheries, Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. She is very VIP people to me. Okay. And she is currently Deputy Director of Science, Technology and International Cooperation Department, and also served as SEAFDEC Alternate Council Director. She's one of my boss for Vietnam. The floor is yours, Madam Yung. Can you open your microphone, I think? So we cannot hear you, Madam Yung. You're my best friend, but we cannot hear your best voice. Sorry. How can we do? Okay. Okay. Yes, we are hearing you loud and clear.
Okay. So thank you, Hurabit, and thank you, SEAFDEC, for organizing this webinar on new consolidated text. The document TL/IL/W/276 of WTO Fisheries Subsidy Negotiation. And today is very special for us to meet on the screen involved in the negotiation in WTO. Since last July up to now. And therefore, today I would like to share some views an observation from Vietnam regarding the text of the chair, the new text of the chair. So first of all, we would like to say the point raised by Japan that Vietnam cannot support the scope of fuel in this agreement. So this point we completely cannot support. And the second, regarding the definition, as you can see for the definition where most open the bracket already, but actually with the new development of the text by the chair, the new text, we can see some concerns as follows. We think this is the trade agreement, binding agreement, but it's not fisheries agreement. Therefore, the negotiation here just only for the trade issue, but based on the existing standards regarding the fisheries management. And here we can see there are some there are good glossaries and definition by FAO we can use for the agreement. Therefore, there are some definitions in the Article 2 with very large scope than the norm and the conceptual standards of the FAO. I would like to give example. The first, relating to the definition of the catching. In the FAO definition, the catching just only include, the fishing just only include the catching, taking, or harvesting, which are directly targeted to the fishing activities. But here is the definition of the fishing in this agreement. This is the definition of the PSMA agreement. So there is one more component, which is the fishing related activities have been included in the definition. And you can see that for the PSMA is just only more than 60 parties. So I mean that just only 60 members, 60 members of the PSMA, but in the WTO, we have more than 140, I think 55, right? 54. So I think the definition of fishing, and also there is more definition of the fishing related activities in the FAO glossary. We do not have the fishing related activities, and also for the vessel. In the FAO glossary, we have only the fishing vessel, and we don't have the component of the fishing related activity in this. So this is the first we would like to say. We express our concern that this definition with the new text will lead to the commitment exchange binding agreement are higher than the norm of fishery management based on FAO norm and the standards. So this is our first observation and concern. The second, regarding the article number 3, prohibition on subsidy to IUU fishing. Vietnam have the view to support this article. Just only concerns as follows. The concern from Vietnam is related to the determination of the IUU fishing. As you can see from the current draft 276, it seems to be satisfactory handling of fleet management practices in granting affirmative determination by 3 listed entities, which include Carlson State, Tri-State, and IFMO. The integration of affirmative determination and due process into 3.3 to ensure the connection and binding of legal procedures when making affirmative determination. However, we do think that the due process of the new trade text has not addressed the issue of IUU determination in overlapping areas, where there are claims of the marine water territorial jurisdiction inconsistent with UNCLOS. So the situation may happen that what happened if two custom states win claim in one area, therefore who will play the role of the flag states and who will play the role of the custom state? The due process in Article 3.3 have not addressed these issues. So this is our concern for the overlapping area. And actually, I think it is really the reality in some marine countries in the Southeast Asia. So the second issue is relating to the geographical approach, like a discussion between Japan and Philippines, as well as the issue raised by the Commonwealth. And here we are very concerned about the using the geographical approach with the term of territorial sea or the term of nautical miles using in the IU text as well as the text 276 as a whole in order to search the SDT for the small scale. And the reason why we concerned about it is follows. We do think that the misinterpretation or the inadequate interpretation and application paving for the way for a different approach to small scale and artisanal fishing. So this can create unpredicted impact to the future on professional and technical discussion by using geographical terms to small-scale fishery. And in this regard, we completely agree with Guragrit about the concept and definition of the small scale. So is it possible that we can use a term of the geographical terminology and geographical concept in order to use for exemption to the small-scale fishery in this agreement? So if like that, we will accept a new norm and new concept for the small-scale fishery. This is like I make analysis for the definition in the Article 2. We don't like to have more exemption or more additional implication for the concept and definition regarding the fishery outside the FAO concept. This is the second point we're concerned about the Article 3. The third issue for the footnote 4, we know that the fishing related activities are not covered by the IUU concept, IUU definition in this agreement. And also this is not included in the concept of the FAO for the definition in the International Plan of Action on the IUU fishing. Regarding the overfishing and overcapacity, we highly appreciate the effort of Japan and our small group in order to develop the hybrid approach with the prohibition and flexibility, and we do agree that this create a more flexibility for the developing countries, and we highly appreciate the position of Japan as well as the EU in order to develop this article, the Article 551. But we still have one issue we would like to raise here for discuss and maybe more clarification, and maybe we can find out the common position in the ASEAN countries. So if I can understand from the text, from the last sentence, we have a Japan representative here today, and maybe we can have a further clarification for the idea. So the last sentence, we have the sentence is as follows: the stocks or stocks in the relevant fishery or fisheries. And when we make comparison with the glossary of the FAO regarding the term of the fishery and fisheries, so we can understand that this sentence in conjunction with the footnote 10 means that the reference points have to be defined by species, and single fishing activities like draw, percent, etc. In parallel. So if like that, we should have the reference point for single species by particular fishing activity, fishing year. And if that, this will create more difficulties and challenges for tropical multi-species fishery in our region, because we have MSY and different points for the total production for some main species, but we cannot have own indicators and different points for single species in accordance with specific fishing activity, fishing year. It's very, very difficult because the developing country in which have Vietnam, we don't have sufficient capacity to assess the fish stock and stock assessment to one as we understand. Okay, so this is some concerns from Vietnam, and so for the for this web seminar from Vietnam point of view, we would like to make cooperation with the member countries in order to support whether are there any additional reference points we can put in the footnote 10 and footnote 9 of the agreement, because we can have a situation in the region, and besides the reference points proposed by the tech chair, so we can see the current situation of the member countries in terms of the stock assessment. We can have a more common position in the footnote, as well as footnote 10 and footnote 9 for the common position at the WTO. Okay, so this is all of the Vietnam, and one issue I would like to come back from the Colin and Alice mentioned for the beginning discussion with the question is that what happened if the WTO member not ratify the agreement. So I would like to put one additional point that in principle, this is the multilateral agreement, and this is a multilateral agreement. So it means that this agreement must not ratify because cannot protect the livelihood, like Colin mentioned, the income and a lot of difficulty for the fishing community. So there will be another chance. This will be a plurilateral agreement, and if like that, as it implies that WTO member country would be given to the choice to agree the new rule on a voluntary basis. But actually, through negotiation, a lot of the members do not support for the plurilateral agreement. So I just would like to give additional point for the situation if we cannot have the consensus for the WTO agreement on the subsidy fishery. Thank you, David, and thank you everyone.
Yes.
For,
Thank you very much, Madam Yung. You raised very your last sentence very important. If in case we cannot wait any longer, I think 20 years term is long enough for I think grow my daughter. She's now in the university already. So I think the point again, the artisanal and small scale fishing and definitions also on affirmation, determination of the term is still in questions for Vietnam and also of course for Japan. I think next week we can have a more detailed discussion on each country view on this. I don't know. The last sentence that Madam Jung mentioned is voluntary. In case the WTO members cannot have any landed point of this agreement, do you suggesting that the WTO will go the way of using this as the voluntary agreement, or what? What kind of I don't know.
No. Actually, I would like to put to provide more additional point. That for example, if like Vietnam, our principle do not agree with the scope of this agreement include the fuel, for example, like that. But if all the countries agree on the fuel, this is principle we cannot accept. So we cannot agree. So if we like one or two sides, it becomes another kind of the agreement, cannot call the multilateral agreement. So the point important here that we all member WTO must agree upon on the text and the contents of the agreement. This is my point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think I'm clear from your clarifications, Madam Dr. Alice and Dr. Corinne. What do you think this point? In case, I think in many countries, many states are still, for example, developing countries, and many of them are, for example, single stock assess, single species of aquatic species. Utilization is not easy to assess, and in many terms are still not so comfortable for many states. For example, in Southeast Asia, is there any landing year that they're targeting next year or another few years more, or this coming ministerial meeting will be end by agreements of this text, or I don't know. I would like to hear from you. Is there any expecting July 15, as Dr. Colin mentioned? Maybe it's not the end, or what you can tell us, what's happening after that? Thank you. Maybe you could start from Dr. Alice.
Certainly, thank you. And thank you, Madam Nguyen, for an extremely useful, in fact, for all of the SEAFDEC members, for very useful explanations of the position. I have found it very helpful to hear, because I don't sit in the room, so it's very useful to hear how members are reacting to these different parts of the agreement. Maybe then to answer sort of both questions at once. You know, I think it's been discussed a lot in Geneva, the fact that members' fisheries management systems differ. Everyone is doing the best they can to manage their fisheries. And I think members are now very aware that multi-species and data-poor fisheries are a particular challenge, right, in terms of fisheries management. And in fact, I think the language that is in footnote 9 and footnote 10 around alternative reference points based on indicators such as the level of depletion, etc., that language, as I understand it, was put in to try and make the idea of a biologically sustainable level a wider concept, that as wide as possible a range of members could use, right? That they could demonstrate through various scientific measures that they have available that the fishery is at this biologically sustainable level, to make 511 as wide and as accessible as possible. Now, if it doesn't quite respond to the needs of, or the different ranges of fisheries management that members have in place, then that is going to be a key piece of work to do in the next few weeks, to decide how do we change the language of footnote 9 and footnote 10 so that it can reflect a broader range of stock states, of stock kinds, right? Because I think what we want to achieve in footnote 9 and footnote 10 is that we want it to be clear what the result is that we're aiming for, right? We want members to be able to demonstrate that a stock, or that a fishery rather, is that the stocks in a fishery are at a biologically sustainable level. So if we need to include different language to capture the way that multi-species fisheries are managed, let's have a discussion about what that language is, right? So that 511 can be applied to a range of different fisheries. I think that is definitely the objective. So that's the technical part of the question. I think the broader and the sort of the procedural and political part of the question, I mean, perhaps to go from, yeah, we want footnote 9 and 10 to be written in a way that can apply to a wide range of fisheries. Agreed. My perspective is that the real value of a WTO agreement, as opposed to a plurilateral one, as opposed to the CPTPP, which we already have, is precisely that everyone is included, right? That it is a common endeavor that covers the small countries and the very large countries. That is the value of having everyone in this agreement. That is going to involve making trade-offs and making flexibilities so that everyone feels they can contribute something to the agreement. But I think that's the real value of a multilateral agreement over a plurilateral one. And we have some already, some plurilateral kind of fisheries subsidies obligations. So that is just the nature of a multilateral negotiation, right? In terms of the time frame, I mean, my sense from what I read is that the WTO Director General is pushing very hard for there to be as close as possible to an agreement on the 15th of July. So I think this is she is putting a lot of political effort behind getting the agreement concluded. Now, will she be, will members be prepared to agree to a final text a month from now? Maybe. Maybe not, right? I guess, and this is the trade-off between doing something as fast as possible and also getting a result that really is meaningful and makes sense. So that is a political judgment and a political process of which I have very little visibility. So I can't tell you how likely it will be. But the last point perhaps to make in closing, and it's one that it comes back to this question of ratification and implementation. And it is that, and this is a very personal perspective, I think it is important that this agreement sets a set of rules that people, that countries, that governments, that members feel that they can live with, not necessarily that they are currently compliant with, but that they feel they can become compliant with before they ratify, right? So I think it's important, at least from a sustainable development perspective, I would like to see an agreement that does push policies to change a little bit, right? And so not necessarily an agreement that reflects what everybody currently does, so no one has to change, but an agreement that reflects where people would like where they think they can get their policies to be in 5 years from now, in 6 or 7 years from now, that pushes policies to change even very slightly, because that, I think, is what this agreement can achieve, potentially. So that is my last point. I hope that helps a little bit in your thinking. I'm happy to come back to the point. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Alice. And Dr. Colin, you have any additional points to that? Yeah,
Thank you,
please.
Chair. Thank you, Chair. Just to highlight that the current text is especially for SEAFDEC members, the current text, the whole idea now probably is to give much attention to the language used in the text. And if you look at footnote 9 and footnote 10, which has been referenced to, you see that it's bracketed there and square brackets, and that means that we have to maybe probably discuss the language in there so that it suits what we want to deliver. And Alice pointed here that it's all the issue of biological sustainable stocks, whether you have them or not, and that is important. How do we place this in terms of language? This is where the legal minds come in terms of helping in drafting the language. So I would think that now the onus is on you to look at this and see how best to put the language. And I think your next meeting, which is tomorrow, these are some of the issues which you should be looking into in terms of coming up probably. I've seen that already you've started negotiating on this forum in terms of countries giving their positions. And I think it is important that this is going, it is happening now, so that you are actually in preparing the mood for negotiations as members tomorrow. So it is important that we focus on the language so that it captures your interest. And in terms of the time frame with the ministers and whether there will be near complete text by then, I'm not sure, because I think what is emerging from Geneva is that there's still considerable work to do, and it's only a matter of about a few weeks, 3 if not weeks, to the ministers' meeting. And from my experience, it wouldn't be proper to present a text which is littered with brackets to the ministers. And because the ministers, most of them are not technical people, and they wouldn't know some of these issues in there. It all depends on the technical people to advise the ministers on the way to go. And when it's bracketed like this, for instance, if there is a minister from one country who is an expert on fisheries and the minister from another country who is not, there is that, it won't work well in terms of who gets what out of the agreement. So normally, a clean text would be ideal for ministers. And I'm not sure whether it is feasible now, given probably the pressure that is on all negotiators in terms of coming up with an outcome. Maybe we might see some compromises in some areas, but I would like to think that as you discuss this text tomorrow, that should be in your heads as to where can you contribute to compromise. And of course, not in the sense that you lose your interests are overridden by what will come in the text, but to see how we can best move the whole process forward. And from my hand, as someone who has been in negotiations for a while, I'm not quite confident that there will be clean text by the 15th of July. But in any case, whatever will be there, I think the ministers are in a position to give direction as to how to proceed, and probably give timelines in terms of when they can be concluded, and it also gives them an understanding of the issues under discussion, and which will enable them to come with political decision. And some of the issues there really need political decisions. So I think that's the advantage that the 15th of July meeting might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Colin, for your clarifications. I think just quick questions and answer on the one question in the Q&A. based on the WTO negotiation group on rules and rules for fishery subsidies, can we request to have a common position for ASEAN? I think the answer is no. I think no, we cannot request the common position ASEAN. I think the flaw of negotiation under the WTO negotiation group is in individual country basis, right? It's not like what I experienced from my participating in the CITES COP. Some group of countries can represent for example, the common position of the EU like that. But in this fora, it is no kind of speak on behalf of the group of the countries. Is there any existing mechanism on rules or ways of procedure to provide statement like that? Dr. Colin or Alice, you have any views on that? In case some country would like to say on behalf of others like ASEAN, is that?
You want to go, Alice? I don't know. I can go first. I'm not quite sure how it will work, but from what I'm getting right now, from the understanding I'm getting, is that as SEAFDEC, you want to come up with some kind of position or common position, which probably each member country might want to take into the WTO. I'm not sure, but I would like to think that this will require you guys negotiating again to come up with common positions. So, like I said, I already had a kind of a mini negotiation now, and I would like to think this is what is going to happen tomorrow. And normally, I think once that happens, then at the WTO, I think you'll be able to co-sponsor a paper or a proposal. As you don't necessarily present it as SEAFDEC, but you can co-sponsor as members of the WTO to put those common positions which you might have come up with. I think that's the way it can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Alice, do you have any additional points before we go to the next speaker, our last speaker of the day?
No, thank you. Nothing to add. I did see a couple of hands up. They may wish to respond to the question you're putting to the group. Thank you.
Okay, Madam Yung, yes, please, Madam Yung, you should take your earphone and that system out before speaking. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Horovik, for reminding me. Okay. So actually, we are asking to your questions about how we can have the common voice at the WTO. Actually, there are some mechanisms existing in the WTO negotiation, like an ACP group. They just deliver the speech on behalf of the ACP group. So for the ASEAN country, if we can have the delivery note like the other mechanism in the WTO negotiation, is very difficult because we have the long process through different channels in order to have the final common voice of the ASEAN countries, for example, like that. So I would like to propose the mechanism as follows, because as you can see now, we have non-ending working. So every week we have the negotiation, and every week we have to express our point of views in regarding the text and the contents of the agreement. So is it possible we can discuss on the 17th that if SEAFDEC does a focal point with the member of the ASEAN SEAFDEC member countries, we can see from negotiation that completely lack of the participants from the fishery agency involved in the negotiation. So the key point we have to bring back to the countries after this meeting that now we have the HOD level, HOD head of delegation negotiation now, and we move very quickly to the minister negotiation. So the participation of the fisheries sector in this process in order we can prepare like the format notes of the ASEAN SEAFDEC country, and you can bring the issue there, and we can take the point from the other country to see what issue will be the common, what issue will be the consensus, and we will raise this point at the meeting. So this is the point we can have the mechanism to strengthen the cooperation in the ASEAN SEAFDEC countries. So like before, when we work under the SEAFDEC, we have the experience when we attend the course of the SEAFDEC already. So we have the the format observation and the format analysis and the note, the notes, common notes. Like a sentence for the member country to use and to deliver, to prepare the note for the HOD when they make interfere to the negotiation. And if like that, we should have very active mechanism from the SEAFDEC and like the channel, the hotline channel among the ASEAN SEAFDEC countries during the negotiation. Actually, for negotiation, we have small working group with involvement from the different countries in the region, headed by Japan and EU already. But actually, we still have the another kind of mechanism like a hotline for the WTO negotiation with the technical support from the SEAFDEC in this regard. This is my proposal. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Yung, and very clear that yes, we can have if we can have our common position in place on 17 June next week. We try our best to do that. I think last but not least, we have our speaker still with us, our colleague from the Philippines, Mr. Jeremy. He is also very active on this issue. He's the Department of Agriculture alternate chief negotiator on all fisheries in the WTO, and he just takes in the chat that he experienced in providing the documents of the common position of ASEAN on fisheries into the WTO negotiation a few years ago. And he is director and agriculture counselor designate Philippines agriculture from European Affairs for European Affairs based in Brussels. Welcome our colleague and last speaker. The floor is yours.
Good late afternoon or evening rather in Bangkok and somewhere else. And of course, my colleagues were approaching noontime, and thank you for the time today. I would just like to just go back to the objective of the meeting, which is to, as we discussed it, if ASEAN or SEAFDEC would have common position. And since I understand that ASEAN and each and every SEAFDEC member is a WTO member, we can have a common position. The issue there is, in fact, whether we could have, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have. Based on my engagement with ASEAN and our discussion the last time, I think we have some commonality with respect to the IUU fishing discipline. On the rest of the disciplines, we may have diversity, which I think a big challenge to have a common position. But nevertheless, this is just my view based on my engagement with our ASEAN colleagues. But just to touch upon on the, it's nice that I'm at the last because I could make a critique as well as a summary, as well as I could perhaps present in general the position of my country. And I would start on the core disciplines of the chair's text. And before I do, I would just like to mention that the chair is brave enough, and perhaps I could congratulate him for coming out finally with a draft of his own, because forgive me for the nuances, before the document was a room document. Now it's the chair's text. So he owns this and he's responsible for the text, meaning that he's very serious. So I think that's very important to note. And the second point is that whether we can have an agreement July 15. I don't know if I can answer that, but I think if ASEAN could have a common position based on the chair's text by July 15, maybe we have a chance to have an agreement by July 15. So I think that's how I would answer that. But going back to the substantive and to the core discipline, so I would go straight to Article 3. I think Article 3, I think the most important development here is the elimination of other determining entities, like, for example, port state, and as well as subsidizing state. I think this is a very good development, and it could really contribute to the agreement, at least in this pillar of the core discipline, so IUU fishing discipline. As far as my delegation is concerned, in general, we can go on the direction of the text, except that we still maintain that in the determination of IUU, it should be based on international law, which unfortunately it's already deleted from the previous text to the text of the chair. We think that IUU determination must be based on international law, but there's a question about what international law. When we say international law, we are merely referring to UNCLOS, because UNCLOS defines the demarcation of territories and entitlements of each geographical areas. Namely, if you talk about territorial waters, you know where is territorial water. You cannot have a different interpretation where territorial water is. For example, I know some countries in Latin America, their territorial waters, because they don't ratify UNCLOS, is 250 nautical miles. So imagine if you provide flexibilities to these countries based on territorial waters discussion, then you have a problem because you have no equality in terms of measurement. The Philippines would have flexibility up to 12 nautical miles, while some Latin American countries would have 250 nautical miles flexibility. So imagine that. So it's very important that international law is stated in this agreement. But nevertheless, in general, IUU fishing disciplines as drafted by the chair maybe can be worked out in the end by from our side. Now, to the next discipline, Article 4. Overfished discipline, for me, it's a nuisance, perhaps, a discipline, because this discipline suggests that I could say it personally. You should have, if you are still subsidizing an overfish condition, then your system must be addicted to subsidies, meaning that you cannot operate more if you don't subsidize. So to me, this discipline per se, having a discipline on overfish, is already something that is perhaps unthinkable. But of course, the Philippines will not block any eminent agreement just because of this discipline. But for us, this is something very, very flexible. We don't think that we should provide subsidies to already overfish condition. Also because it is connected to the overcapacity and overfishing discipline. Imagine it's already overfish condition under Article 4, and you can still subsidize provided that you have fish management that maintains or that tries to recover. The thing there is, in the first place, how come a fishing area has become already in overfish condition, and yet you can still subsidize? So for us, this is something that is unthinkable. Now, moving to Article 4. Now, assuming that you are not in overfish condition, and now you are avoiding to reach the level of overfishing and overcapacity, and we are not very happy with the text because we prepare a listing approach. But nevertheless, I understand that the chair put this fish management criteria as an exemption. Having said that, which makes the discipline, I would say, very relaxed, and it should not be worrisome to members, especially those subsidizers, because the mere fact that you have fish management provides you the guarantee that you can continue to subsidize. Now, going to the special and differential treatment, if you don't have fish management in place under this discipline, you can still subsidize on the basis of special and differential treatment. And we have the same view as of Japan, that there seems to be too much flexibility as to the elements of flexibility being given to developing countries. We think that I mentioned it because around I would say 18 of developing countries contribute around 80% of the global catch. So imagine if you do not discipline, if you provide a lot of flexibilities for these countries, then I don't think that we are achieving the mandate that is under the SDG target 14.6 and also the Hong Kong mandate on fishery subsidies. Now on the I think to add insult to injury, if I could use that terminology, we don't have a very straightforward dispute settlement that really tries to ensure that the effects of subsidy can be checked. I think at the moment, the dispute settlement provision is just a borrowed instrument based on what is already, even without the fishery subsidies agreement, you already have this provision. We think that there must be a specific provision relating to the scientific and technical verification on whether stocks have been depleted because of the subsidies. Without it, we do not think that the core discipline, for example, the sustainability criteria, which is very, very weak already because the WTO is giving a lot of leeway to coastal states, the subsidizer, to determine whether a stock is overfished or not. And if you bring that matter in the WTO dispute settlement, it would seem that the panel would have difficulty really determining whether the subsidies could actually resulted to overfishing and overcapacity, when other scientific evidence available may not have the same weight as the scientific evidence or available to the coastal state would have provided. So for us, this is something that that is also problematic. Now, if I could just focus on the most sensitive, which is a red line for the Philippines, which I think very important in the discussion or question whether we will have agreement by 15 July or even December of this year, is this
You've lost him.
Yes, I think we lost him. Jeremy, are you there? Okay, we lost him. Okay, he's come back. Okay. Yes, please continue. Yes, open your microphone. Sorry. Please open your microphone, Jeremy. Sorry.
Hello.
Thank you.
Sorry for the glitch. Maybe my internet or maybe somewhere. But anyway, my final point that is very important for ASEAN colleagues and SEAFDEC colleagues to appreciate is our strong serious concern on 11.4b, which is the non-applicability of filing a dispute when the fishing in question is disputed by multiple. We think that this issue has no place in the agreement, and I think Russia also has the same view as that, although they have different objectives from the Philippines. The Philippines' objective is to base all IUU fishing determination on international law, and we cannot just deem by mere of superfluous, or if I could say that, or out of thin air, somebody would say that that fishing area is mine, or it's if you have a territorial dispute and therefore you cannot bring me to court. This is something that the Philippines will have strong opposition, and we will not be able to support that. Nevertheless, we are asking for a very minor suggestion to modulate this language, to have an exemption that cases that are already addressed by international court should not be considered as disputed anymore, and those that are and those who are still disputing the international ruling should be able to demonstrate their arguments also based on the relevant procedures and rules of international law, meaning that nobody can just claim that one area is disputed just because they said so. And therefore, we think this is a big loophole in the discipline, and the Philippines will be affected by this if we're not addressed by this. So without further much ado, we know in the interest of time, these are my presentation, some of which are not necessarily position of the Philippines, but in general they are. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for your very comprehensive and some of the points that you raised. I think we can have time for a week to conclude our few points that very important raised by our special guests, Dr. Colin and Dr. Alice, and positions that given by our colleagues from SEAFDEC member countries, Japan, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. I think next week we can have more further the discussion on this issue, article by article. I think we can jump here and there when we have discussion only among SEAFDEC member countries. I think my conclusion is that we have still question marks on terms and definitions in many places in the text, latest text that provided by the chair. Yes. Okay. I saw our colleague coming back. You have anything to say, Mr.
Sorry, sorry to come back, but I'm disappointed to hear my colleague's Philippines observation. Can we just generally support chair's text, and or can we support the chair's hybrid approach? I think it would be useful. Otherwise, it's meaningless just to have a common position just for IUU pillar. What do you think?
Yes, if my hearing is correct, Japan asking whether if our colleague under the pillar of IUU is that the hybrid approach in there is. Did you say that the Philippines position is what maybe the Japan would like to see to hear again? While he's leaving the room, he is coming back because maybe he wished to clarify that point. Just, yep.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I was not clear because maybe I was off for a while. Well, my only thinking is that I think ASEAN can only have a common position on IUU fisheries disciplines. Because in other areas of the discipline, we seem to have differences of opinion, at least up to this stage. So when I was referring to ASEAN common position, if we cannot fully have a common position for all elements of the chair's text or in the chair's text, we might at least have some elements that we can have common position. And my personal observation and assessment is that there seems to be, in general, common position with respect to the Article 3 or the IUU fishing discipline under the chair's text. So I hope I made that clarity. If we could have common position for all of the elements, why not? I think that's what that's where the Philippines will go. But I think the reality is that the position right now of ASEAN members is a reflective of their positions in Geneva. And over the years, and I mentioned before, when I was still a junior negotiator, I used to draft common position for ASEAN. But that common position in ASEAN is only talking about special and differential treatment. We could not have common position on other elements. So this is just to share to you my own personal assessment, being the perhaps one of the longest negotiators still surviving. Even I'm already in Brussels, I'm still connected to. Personal assessment is that if the discipline would only be IUU fishing, perhaps we could have a common position in ASEAN. And perhaps if there's no territoriality issue outside ASEAN, then perhaps the WTO members can also have a common position on IUU fishing. But if you were to ask me, I don't think we can have on any at the moment.
Yes, thank you. I think very clear. I see the same thing. Based on our experience, we have never have all in the text agree in common among ASEAN, but we have some part of it, some section, some article that they have a common position. For example, last COP18 in CITES COP, we have some listed proposal that ASEAN have the same common position, but not all proposals. Is that okay to you? You can. Is that?
I understand, but the hybrid approach of OFS and OCOF are kind of a coexistence approach, namely not only list approach but also effect approach. So it's combined hybrid. So even so, Philippines cannot support the hybrid approach. Am I correct?
We say that we have issues there, but it's beyond my. I don't know what my minister would say on the 15th. But as far as we're concerned, this text remains problematic because they are. If you look at it, because I could not share the only two slides that I prepared. I have made an assessment, only one with picture, but I cannot share it with you. I was trying to share it, but I cannot share it. I don't know. So maybe I have problem. But our assessment is that this discipline actually hardly disciplines anything. So in practice, because it gives so much leeway on countries. This is both developed and developing, although developed countries will contribute more because they don't have special and differential treatment flexibility. And I can understand why Japan has strong opposition on that. But our position is not because Japan is contributing more than that, but because our position is developing countries who are really into fishing and contributing a lot in terms of fishing effort globally is not contributing as much, and that's the basic opposition why we are not very happy with the text. It's not because of Japan. It's not because of an opposite direction. I can understand that Japan would like Article 5.1, 5.2, which gives a centerpiece on fish management. If you have the fish management, you can actually subsidize anything. So I don't know what else to worry about. And there's a presumption that if you have the fish management, it's sustainable. Because I think our earlier speakers, Dr. Collins and also Alice, mentioned about how you determine whether the subsidies actually did not contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. And this is very much a function of dispute settlement. But if you look at the dispute settlement provision as it is now, it doesn't tell you whether they would really determine if there is a negative effects on the stocks. And because even the determination whether the stocks is overfished or not is to be determined by the subsidizer. So I actually do not understand why members, especially those that are subsidizing, should be worried about the text. And I think they should be the one be supporting the chair's text because it's really accommodating their interests. But as to the mandate, especially SDG 14.6, we really don't know whether we are trying to address the sustainability issue, because we're just saying that if you have fish management, then everything is all right. But the thing is, most members, particularly developed countries, have fisheries management. But why the fishing effort continues to decline, and why depletion of resources continue? So, but of course, there are a host of reasons why, but we think that subsidies can contribute a lot. And that's where we're coming from. So I'm not saying that all elements here is red line. What we're saying is you're still problematic. We don't know, but we will still continue try to improve it, especially the overcapacity and overfishing. We don't think that Article 4 is necessary, the overfish condition, because when you overfish, if you don't respect, for example, this overfishing and overcapacity discipline, you can still subsidize because there is overfish condition. So you subsidize under Article 5, you overfish, then you stop the subsidy. Now you invoke Article 4, you say now it's overfish, we will still subsidize because anyway, we have fish management. And we will the subsidizer will say, it's not overfish because according to the rules, it is the coastal state, the subsidizing member, who will determine whether the stocks is overfished or not. So this is what I'm saying. So maybe if subsidizers would only look at the text of the chair, maybe they will agree with the chair's text because it supports this their predicament. I'm not saying that it's not legitimate. What we're saying is that this could really serve their interest in the negotiation. So maybe right now I'm more convinced that perhaps there might be something that could happen positive in July or maybe in December. But as you know, merely agreeing, as also pointed out by Alice, that there's a protocol of amendment and there might be also another processes. Even if you have already a decision, you still need to amend the GATT agreements, which will take 1 or 2 years or 3 years, and depending really on what you are giving to on the table and what is the agreement. If I can assess it now, I would say you're only disciplining 5% of the target, and 95% is already previous. So this is my personal assessment. So going back, if there will be ASEAN position, if you're asking me now, I think the IUU part, we can join an ASEAN position. For the rest, we will continue to have reservations. But let's see. Our red line now is on territoriality. So if you want this text, if you want this, if you think it serves your interest, I would appreciate if you could help the Philippines try to navigate within this territoriality and issue, because this is the red line for us.
Yes, thank you very much. I think very useful for us as a food for thought for next week. Thank you, Jeremy. I think for the sake of the time, I think we come now 5:10 p.m. in Bangkok time. I think we would like again thanks to all of our speakers for this afternoon in Thailand time, and Bangkok would like to appreciate all of our speakers here. I think I would like to request last but not least our section to say some words to our speakers and audience for today before closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uravit. My last statement for this very important webinar is wow. I hope from the beginning of this webinar that it's going to be fruitful, but I don't expect that it's going to be very.
vấn đề ở chỗ là
Okay. Thank you once again for all the speakers and for the SEAFDEC member countries. See you next week. It will be a very important day. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you once again, our speakers and everyone to join us this afternoon. Hope you have a good health and see you, our member countries next week, and see you around. Thank you. Thank you very much.
okay, bye bye and see you.
Bye.
Không.